There once was a girl named Heidi, whose parents had died when she was very young. Heidi's Aunt Diet took poor Heidi in and saw to her upbringing. Then, when Heidi was 6, Diet got a job in Frankfurt. It was not possible for Heidi to join Diet in Frankfurt at that time, but Diet knew that it was a golden opportunity she could not pass up. Heidi would have to stay with someone else. But who? The only person Diet could think of was Heidi's grandfather, an old hermit who lived in the nearby mountains known as the Alps. Heidi's grandfather was a very strict, grumpy old man. He didn't like people and lived alone on his alpine pasture. He was very surprised when Diet and Heidi arrived at his house one evening. Diet explained to him that Heidi had to stay with him now, and that Heidi could no longer be her responsibility. The grandfather was furious. He didn't want to take care of anyone. The two adults quarreled until he lost his patience and demanded that Diet leave and never step in his house again. Leave she did, but Heidi still remained. The old man had no idea what to do with Heidi. He sat down and rested his forehead on his hands. Little Heidi remained silent. She didn't understand what was going on. Grandfather showed Heidi the inside of the house. Heidi found a big soup tumbler, a fireplace, and a big ladder going up to a small loft. However, Heidi couldn't find a room for herself. "Oh, grandfather, where shall I sleep?" she asked. "Don't bother me," the grandfather replied gruffly. "Just find a place for yourself." Heidi grew sad. She decided to climb up to the loft. In the loft, Heidi found thick bundles of hay and a big round window. She went to the window, and the view of the mountains took her breath away. Well, she thought, if I have to sleep anywhere, it's going to be by this window. She took some of the hay and made a little bed for herself. It had been a very long day, and she was asleep the moment she closed her eyes. When she woke the next morning, Heidi was very hungry. She climbed down the ladder and found food on the table. Her grandfather was outside doing some chores. As Heidi reached for some bread, she accidentally bumped the glass of milk onto the floor and broke it. Grandfather heard the commotion, and when he saw what Heidi had done, got very angry. Just then, Peter, the goatherd, entered the house. The grandfather scolded Peter for being late and ordered him to bring Heidi when he took the goats out to pasture. He didn't want Heidi breaking more things in the house that day. Heidi went up the mountain with Peter and his goats. Peter fell asleep, and Heidi played with the animals. She became very friendly with a small kid and gave it lots of hugs and extra food. Heidi loved her time in the mountains and accompanied Peter every day after that. Weeks passed. It was a sunny afternoon like any other when Heidi spotted something extraordinary. Hovering over the edge of a cliff, she saw a great eagle. Heidi and the baby goat walked closer to the cliff to watch the eagle. Suddenly, the giant bird swooped down to grab the goat. Heidi pushed the animal out of the eagle's way, and the young goat skittered off the edge of the cliff. Heidi scrambled to hang on to the kid. She tried to pull it up, but couldn't. The weight of the little animal was beginning to pull her off the cliff as well. Hanging on with all her might, she called for help. Her calls woke Peter, and he ran to her aid. He grabbed Heidi and pulled her and the goat up. Heidi was badly hurt. Her knees and hands were scraped and bleeding. Peter took her home. Grandfather was worried when he saw that Heidi was hurt. He gently cleaned her wounds and gave her hot milk to drink. Heidi was touched by his kindness. She hugged her grandfather and told him that she would never leave him. Tears ran down grandfather's cheeks. He hugged her back and laughed. "I love you too, my little Heidi." From that day onwards, Heidi and her grandfather were inseparable. Heidi helped her grandfather with all of his chores, and he showed her how to feed and care for the animals. They lived a happy life. Time flies easily in happiness, and it soon happened that 3 years had passed. Peter and Heidi were very good friends now. One day, Peter took Heidi to his cottage to meet his grandmother. The cottage was small and shabby, but tidy. Peter's grandmother loved books, but had gone blind and couldn't read anymore. Heidi felt sad for her and wished she knew how to read so that she could help Peter's grandmother enjoy her books once again. When Peter and Heidi returned home, they found grandfather sitting at the table. He held a piece of paper in his hand and was looking quite somber. It was a letter from Aunt Diet. "Your aunt is coming to take you to Frankfurt," grandfather said. Heidi was shocked. How could she leave her beloved mountains? Diet arrived the next day. Heidi's grandfather refused to let Heidi leave. "She can't stay here, don't you see? Heidi needs to go to school," Aunt Diet argued. "She needs to learn how to read and write and how to live in the world, not just tend to goats." Heidi's grandfather knew that Diet was right. Living with an old hermit in the mountains was not the life he wanted for his granddaughter. He gave Heidi an enormous hug and said goodbye. On their way to Frankfurt, Diet told Heidi that she was going to live with the Sesemann family and be a companion to their little girl, Clara. When they reached the Sesemanns' house, they found Clara waiting for them in a wheelchair. Clara had been ill for most of her life, and the stern housekeeper insisted that Heidi take a bath before being around Clara. Clara had been very lonely and was happy to have Heidi around. They got along very well and played together for hours. Clara gave Heidi expensive toys and dresses. Clara's grandmother was overjoyed to see friendship blossom between the two young girls. While at the Sesemann house, Heidi learned to read and write. She studied late into the night with the hope that one day she would get back to the Alps and read books to Peter's grandmother. Although the Sesemanns treated Heidi very well, she was homesick. She missed the mountains, her grandfather, and her friend Peter. She was so homesick that she became very ill. The doctor advised Mr. Sesemann that sending Heidi home was the only cure. Mr. Sesemann was a kind man who cared for Heidi like his own child. He decided to send her back to her grandfather as soon as possible. Heidi, her grandfather, and Peter the goatherd were overjoyed to be reunited, and Heidi's strength returned at once. She was content to be back where she belonged. Clara missed Heidi very badly. The two friends kept in touch by writing letters to each other. The next year, Clara came to visit Heidi. The fresh, high air of the mountains and the goat's milk made Clara grow stronger. Grandfather, Heidi, and Peter took her for a daily walk, and Clara's legs were recovering. Soon she would no longer need her wheelchair. They were on one of their walks when Grandfather stopped the wheelchair and encouraged Clara to stand. Clara tried her very best, and sure enough, she did. Then he asked Clara to try taking a step forward. Clara moved one foot and then the other. Mr. Sesemann and Clara's grandmother had just arrived at Heidi's grandfather's house. They were looking for Clara, and when they found her, they couldn't believe their eyes. Clara was walking! Clara's father was grateful to Heidi and her grandfather and told them that he would like to take responsibility for Heidi's education and well-being. Clara begged Heidi to come back to Frankfurt with them, but Heidi declined. She loved Clara very much, but she couldn't stay away from her grandfather and the mountains. Heidi promised that they would come to Frankfurt for a visit very often. The two friends bade farewell, and Clara and her family went down the mountain. Heidi looked around her. The sky was blue, the air fresh and warm, and the goats were playing on the grass. Heidi was home, where she belonged.